Territorial Agency is a collective that actually talks about redefining of territories at the Anthropocene. And at our exhibition, we have their work called Sensible Zones. For those who don't know, sensible zones are actually 200 meters above sea level and 200 meters below. And they are the most rich and lively and important areas that actually are also the most vulnerable. And because of the two first reasons, they are also the most extracted by human beings. So really the topic of extractivism is something that we keep coming back to. Upstairs, the work shows 4 movements. They talk about the reduction of ice and rise of sea levels. And the last movement was actually commissioned by the Warsaw Biennial and is devoted to the Baltic region, where actually Territorial Agency is also tracking the areas of the forests, of the pushbacks that are happening at the moment. So we are also referring a bit to the previous talk. So at the moment, I want to invite you to listen to John and his speech about climate peace. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the entire invitation to be part of the Biennale. It's been a real pleasure to be instigated by you to think some of the elements of our current preoccupation. The title of the talk this evening is Climate Peace. The hypothesis is very simple, that after the fall of the Berlin Wall, violence didn't just fizzle out. We entered the warm war, and we are right in the middle of the warm war. And people might consider it as a continuation of 500 years of colonialism. I'm interested in understanding the material basis of the contemporary warfare in order to specify a spatial reconfiguration that we call climate peace. So after the Cold War comes warmer, and we need to operate in a shifting landscape. The question of borders is really one that is thought as trespass, as a moment of crossing. The main argument this evening will be that borders are imaginal. They are not only formed by images, they are formed by ways of perception, and they are in particular formed by contemporary forms of technologies that establish clear-cut differences of inside and outside. Who is human, who's not human, who is rich, who's poor, who is a citizen, who is not a citizen. And these are all structures of borderline and border fencing that are to be traced not only in protocols, not only in laws, not only in algorithms, but the main argument this evening is really they are to be traced in the image, in the imaginal. And it's really for us, Territorial Agency, Anne-Sophie and myself, but the entire teams at Territorial Agency, so important to be always so close to the art world, exactly because of our interest in the very ambiguous nature of the image, and how the image always keeps back from the possibility of attaining, of holding on, and maybe even becoming somehow efficacy. We are not interested in efficacy of activism. We are really refraining from that. We think that this is part also of the problem. So this evening I would like to introduce you to some ideas around climate peace. And I will start with a very basic idea of a new figure. And it's a new figure in the making. It's made up of everything that we think we design, everything we think we control, everything that we think is within our remit. Cities, cars, technologies, tables, plantations, fisheries. And the question where we want to start is a simple one. How heavy is all of this? It's a very simple question, and as architects, we focus on this beautiful little word that, with 4 letters, the city. It's a word that carries a lot of imagination, but it's something really that we cannot recognize anymore. It's something that we have no capacity of determining, and with it, no capacity of articulating in any significant way what it means to be a citizen, what it means to inhabit a polis and shape it. The figure in the making that we are trying to delineate with this simple question of how heavy is a city is made up of everything that sustains humans. Everything that we eat and drink, domesticated animals and plants, plantations, cows, chicken, all the fisheries, the trawling of the sea, and the information fluxes, the bureaucracies, the laws, the intricacies of the structures that we give ourselves through language to articulate those material fluxes, and of course the energy systems that sustain humanity. The question has a very simple answer. It's a very simple question, but also has a very simple answer. But in between the simple question and the simple answer, which is 30 trillion tons, there's an opening of all kinds of preoccupations, all kinds of preoccupations that really rely on the image and the possibility of moving from an idea of the image as being a mediation between an external world and an internal self to a condition of an existence through images. So 30 trillion tons is a very big number. It has a lot of zeros and a 3 at the beginning. And the only thing that is of comparable magnitude to trillion tons is the content of carbon in the living biosphere, which is around 40 trillion tons. The equivalent, it's really difficult to grasp how big our stuff has become. You can imagine that if we would take everything at the density, let's say, of gravel, we will have around 28 centimeters everywhere. If we start understanding better that the figure that is emerging is part of a complex interference in cycles that regulate the atmosphere, land and ocean, we start seeing that the emergence of this figure is nothing else than the incapacity of our technological devices to recycle. Forests don't drown in leaves. We are the ones who have unleashed the technosphere, who's drowning in its own debris. Primarily, the carbon footprint of the technosphere. The carbon footprint that is in the sky and is going to be in the sky for several 100,000 years to come. And slowly, as it comes down, it acidifies the waters, it changes the structures of the vegetation, and the entire cycles have been modified. The hypothesis of the technosphere by Peter Haff, who is a paleontologist, we work a lot with scientists at Territorial Agency, is that from within it looks as if we are in control of it. But as a planetary paradigm, it is now a self or a quasi-self-organizing system. Similar in magnitude and scale, both time scale and spatial scale, to the lithosphere, the atmosphere, the hydrosphere, and the rapidly vanishing cryosphere. And for us, this is a border technology. It's a technology that is trespassing borders. It's rearticulating structures of inhabitation by many species. We'll come back to the notion of speciation later, and is articulating all kinds of transformation that are only to be understood as upheavals, as new border conditions. So the question for us as architects is how to understand these territories, these spatial organizations that are produced by the rise of the technosphere as an architecture. That means as the relationship between a material base and a polity, as between the forms of institutional cohabitation and the forms of the processes and the fluxes that we inhabit. There is an architecture. Architecture is really that specific relation, and it's dominated by border technologies of images. Architecture is an imaginal technology that is very close to the logistical technologies of contemporaneity, but it's really at that intersection that we think there's possibility of articulating this new figure. It's a strange figure because we tend to imagine it as a figure ground condition, that we would be able to determine here the hydro plant in Telemark in Norway being the technological aspect and the forest being nature. In reality, the technosphere has modified completely the cycle of energy, the cycle of water. What is difficult to grasp is that it's not a thing. It's not an external condition. It can never be articulated as a complete element. The technosphere really eludes the possibility of control and is an inversion of agency. We are becoming subservient to the technosphere. We're just one of the components of it. The technosphere is an offshoot of the biosphere, produced by humans or instigated by humans, but we are only a component. If you're interested, there's a little back of the envelope calculation about, you can see what it is made up of, the urban areas, the rural housing, roads and railways and cropland, pasture, all nice and cuddly things that are the markers, the material markers of what we've heard before. The structures that have made day-to-day life into capital life, into forms of capitalism. So the back of the envelope is a very simple indication that we have absolutely no idea, and scientists have absolutely no idea about the cycles that we've disrupted. There's very little capacity to disaggregate the total numbers, to disaggregate how much carbon is processed by life on the planet, how much nitrogen is processed, and we really don't have any serious understanding of those. But a clear marker of a territory is always a semantic condition that warns you not to trespass. A clear marker, of course, is the latest CO2 reading, the 419.5 parts per million. No, sorry, it's already 420 parts per million at the latest measurement at Mauna Loa Observatory of the Scripps Institution of Oceanography in Hawaii. Over the last week, CO2 has gone up and down, day and night. Mauna Loa is in Hawaii, in the northern hemisphere, so it's summer. And you start seeing the levels are high, and then in the night it goes down, high, down. If you look at it over 1 month, it's quite rather stable. If you look at it over 6 months, you start seeing that we've emerged in the northern hemisphere from the rather brown months of winter, and we are now entering the green spring and summer. No? And so CO2 goes up. Over 1 year, becomes like a wave, 2 years, and this is the most important data set that we have as humanity. It's a data set put in place by Professor Keeling of the Scripps Institution. Started in 1958. So all of that going up and down, is nothing else than the breathing of Gaia, nothing else than us breathing. And the interesting thing is that it goes up in the summer and goes down in the winter, but then the next summer it goes further up, and then further up and further up. And in the last 64 years it has gone constantly up. And you might think, this is just a little anomaly because of the conditions of the sun maybe being more active. Over the last 2,000 years, the beginning of, let's say, world-spread industrial revolution, because we're talking about technology and the spread of technology throughout the planet, you start seeing really the beginning of the great acceleration. You start seeing how there's been a slight increase and then suddenly it goes up. During the Holocene, the period since the last glaciation, which is a little bit more than 10,000 years, it's 11,492 years, you start seeing where we are today. There's never been as much carbon in the atmosphere of our only living planet over the last 10,000 years. So this is just an interglacial glitch. And the difficult part really to understand is that over the last 800,000 years, there's never been such a thing. And this is really the marker or at least one of the markers. There are multiple markers of the entrance of this new figure, the Technosphere, which is the marking point of the new geological epoch that we've unleashed. That means the new epoch of our planet history, which is a 4.5 billion years history. Now we are in a new phase. It's called the Anthropocene. We can discuss whether it should be called the Planetariocene, the Holocene, or the Capitalocene. The question is really to focus on the material markers of that technology, the material conditions that we think we are in control of, but it's now unleashed. So the question for us is really how to imagine this. And we think that a space like today, the one upstairs in Warsaw and many other places that we are coalescing with, are there because we can engage in a unique way. And it's one of the few spaces left. The cultural world and the art world is one of the few spaces left that are not being concocted completely by what you might call carbon democracy, an idea that we have possibility of having institutions that where we can regulate through laws. And the question, and we'll see it, is that even that idea of a public space of negotiation is part of the technosphere. It's part of the information fluxes that shape us. A little pushback on different projects of territorial agency, the Museum of Oil, which we initiated with Greenpeace. And we take that in order to show you just two quick graphs and a little image. So, since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, this is the global energy consumption by humans. And you see, again, the hockey stick. And if you're interested, the renewables is the little thickness of the top line. And the data that is available is only 2010 and 12, actually. We have not yet finished the global assessment for 2022 because of the pandemic. If you take the same data and you look at it in relative terms, it becomes more interesting for culture and architecture. So the same data that is growing, it's a rapid acceleration, suddenly you start seeing these waves of successive uses of sources of energy, of mainly different forms of carbon fossils, one after the other. We start from the wood, we move on, and which is dominated by city-states, small agglomerations of people dominating the countryside, but basically moving by horse. And suddenly we increase that, we move into coal extraction, which requires much larger organizations of empire, requires nation states, parliaments, bureaucracies, cities that become metropolis, expand well beyond the city walls. And then we move into oil. And there we form the international, largely in order to regulate the most volatile aspect of modernity, which is the crude as a commodity. In order to create, the international is, in our mind, really the organization of, that allows the state to be open up, both from above and from beneath, in order to create pressure to extract more oil. The question is what happens with gas global. The globalization is really fueled by gas, with all the wars and the renewable element, and this is the hypothesis of climate peace. It needs to be an energy transition like we've never seen before. No longer aimed at an expansion, an increase, but as a complete reorganization. We think a spatial reorganization of the way we live in order to become cosmopolitan, or better, cosmopolitical. Because cosmopolitan is a beautiful word, but it still relates to that idea of being a citizen of the world. And the problem is that both the city is unrecognizable and the world is unrecognizable. The world is now pushed by the earth. And the only answer we have is logistical. More and more technology, more and more information structures, more and more windmills. And we don't have images, we don't have capacity to articulate that space. And so here, just a few notes about the Museum of Oil, but I'm going to quickly show it, but this is not really the point of the talk. The Museum of Oil is a very simple understanding that we all know that we shall need to keep oil in the ground. But we also know that we are not going to do it. Because who should keep oil in the ground? We? Why not the Russians? Why not you? So the question is how to create from that impossibility of taking the decisions, and it will have to be many decisions to keep oil in the ground, and transform them into a space of negotiation, into a cultural space where we can shape the new images that determine what it means to live together, what it means to be humans, if it's a category that we can still deploy in the 21st century. So you see, it's a very simple research project behind the scenes of the McDonald's of environmentalism, Greenpeace, and that also becomes a large exhibition. I'm going to skip on some of the images, but the 30 trillion tons is here deployed in order to understand the footmarks of the most disruptive element of all. That is the fact that oil is changing our democracies, is making our economies extremely volatile, and on top of that, or maybe at the side of that, it's also environmentally damaging. At the side of that, we tend to think that the problem is solvable through technology. There's a techno fix. We might have better pipes, we might have better markets. The reality is that the damage is on our economies. We are all exposed to stranded assets, basically. All our buildings, all our stock exchanges, our pension schemes, our pension funds are all into oil, which are basically unburnable, which means it's stranded. And so the entire global economy is at risk because of oil. On top of that, we are at risk because it's getting warmer and warmer. On one side, we are at risk because of world systems, and on the other side, we are at risk because of the Earth system. World systems analysis is a category of thought developed largely by Manuel Wallerstein, around which you can understand the resistance of certain structures of center-periphery and domination that categorize all aspects of sociality, from identity, individual, national, sexual, family identity, gender identity, all the way, or political identity, all the way to the conditions through which we determine our civilizations. And the question is that they remain, they structure themselves as territories that have duration. Earth system is the way in which scientists smuggle and they cross the borders into politics. And they smuggle an idea that is James Lovelock's idea of Gaia. So Earth system is Gaia light. You take away all the New Age and the fact that it's multiple, we don't know how to handle it, and then you have the Earth system, something that you can calculate in a supercomputer. The question is how to see it, how to see the relationship between those two. And these are the images that we think could be interesting starting to develop, the imaginal technologies of borders, which are the extractive images, the very structures of surveying, measuring, allotting, which in contemporary terms are coming really from Earth system analysis. The remote sensing of sensors in orbit, under the waves, at the level of the waves, airborne, on lamppost, checking you, the thermal cameras. How close can we be to those images in order to make them tip, in order to somehow be undisciplined enough to make them maybe start reverberating, start having a feedback loops into some kind of capacity of learning itself, so that the technosphere can start recycling. So this is the largest industrial complex in the world. It's the Athabasca tar sands or oil sands in Alberta in Canada. And you might think that this is really a big scar. And you see here multi-temporal analysis of impervious surfaces that are hard over 20 years. In blue is the latest one. But what is interesting is, and it's part of the Museum of Oil analysis, that the largest scars are not those that you might have seen in the films of Greenpeace, with the big bulldozers and the mud and the muck. The largest impact is in the fact that all the records of environmental protection of Canada are being privatized. They're made into intellectual property of the oil companies that might want to exploit that area through the NAFTA agreements, plus the agreement between Canada and the European Union. And so what happens is that every single prospecting for oil becomes a way in which you can snitch away the environmental protection data from the environmental agency and put it into the economical agency. So economics and ecology. So ecology, economy. There are two different versions of the same question of morality. So the argument of the Museum of Oil is that, very simply, we need to understand how to keep oil in the ground, and we need to re-articulate everything in a new way. We need new technologies. We need new images. We need new capacity of being in that space. Now, the difficult thing, of course, is that we are architects. So we tend to think that things need to be stable. We're really brought up as, they need to be lasting. And this is the difficult part. Because that very idea is unleashed by architecture. Stability of all elements in culture comes from architecture. The foundations of things, the structure, even the words that we use to describe our mental elements come from architecture. So there's a burden, there's an onus that architects should have about that. Because contemporary duration is nothing else than a possibility to calculate future and remuneration for projects, which is the collaterals for the global financial system, which is the way in which money is made out of nothing through a loan. And this is really the difficult part. The 30 trillion tons is the global financial system. And if we want to talk about surviving, we need to start thinking something different from stability. So this is why we started looking at oceans. And this is where we encountered Biennale Warszawa, because at the Starts Prize exhibition, you went to see it. We didn't go. You went to see it and you saw the outlines. I'm going to show you very quickly the exhibition on oceans that we've done. The idea is to show you...
Hello, my name is Marcus Ryman. I'm the director of TBA 21 Academy and its home, Ocean Space. Ocean Space is a new center in Venice, catalyzing ocean literacy, research, and advocacy through the lens of art. It's a collaborative platform that brings together artists and scientists, architects and activists and researchers to together foster ocean imagination and ocean action. And as we're in Venice, we chose for the second exhibition of Ocean Space, we chose to work with an architecture collective called Territorial Agency and present their work Oceans in Transformation, which is the culmination of a 3-year long-term research commission that started with the investigation of sea level rise. And what better place to investigate sea level rise than in Venice? So I invite you now to follow me into the exhibition and see the work.
Transformation is with an N.
Territorial Agency has been investigating the Anthropocene, the age of the transformation of the planet, for about past decade or more, trying to contribute to the amount of knowledge produced by various scholars about this particular age and the transformations it brings about. Oceans in Transformation is an attempt to unravel the mechanisms of transformations on the planet from an oceanic point of view, meaning looking at the Anthropocene from the oceans. So the question they are posing initially is, how can we sense, how can we make understand the transformations of the oceanic, whereas the ocean is an area that is invisible, that doesn't afford us a view into its body, if you want. So what instruments, what possibilities of knowing do we have in order to develop an image of the oceans and its transformation? One. And secondly, how can we bring together the various ways of knowing, the various sciences, investigations, data collected on the ocean, so that they form a body of knowledge and are syncretized as one coherent story of the ocean. And in order to do that, they have both developed an aesthetic representation. These are the fields of images and compositions that you see behind me, but also a conceptual repertoire that is very important for us to understand, because it is the ideas, the understanding, the ways of knowing that perhaps also lead us to a better safeguarding of the ocean in our future.
I skipped that part. There's a tendency in thinking that we need open data, that we need access to data. And what is interesting is that when we started working on the ocean as architects, we tend to think, okay, show me the data. And then you go and you meet one institution, another one, and they are largely dominated by military, navy, the research institutions that everything that we know of the oceans and everything that we don't know of the ocean is decided by the navy. But what is interesting is that there's no such thing as open data in science. There's open access data, but not open data. And open data is really when you access data without telling what you're going to do with it and who you are. In science, because of the specific conditions of our instrumented and corrected knowledge through peer reviewing, it's important that you say who you are and what you're going to do with it. So there's no such thing as open data. There's open access data. But what is interesting is that the open access data is really difficult to find. It really lies on servers of hundreds and hundreds of different institutions. And the institutions don't talk to each other. The data is not compatible. It follows different criteria. There's no such thing as CSV files in science. For a very simple reason, scientists tend to make mistakes in the opening protocol of a CSV file, which is invented by IBM. Where are IBM guys? And so what happens is that when we started collecting the data and transforming them into images, and then going back to the scientists, to the policymakers, to the conservationists that had produced the measurements, and suddenly they could see their own data, suddenly something strange happened. They started talking no longer as experts, but they started talking to each other without protectionism. And they were really strange conversations. For instance, in this image, which is across from the Himalayas, all the way to the South Pole, to Antarctica, crossing the Indian Ocean and the deep mining zones, you start having a discussion about the poo of the whales, that is a carbon sink, and the internet cables. Those two data sets don't coincide. You don't have a research process that coincides, that makes the poo of the whales doing the carbon sink and the internet access coming together. It's only through the images, by putting them together, and in an unexpected way, there's a new form of discussion. So this is where I think there's a very interesting condition about imaginal technologies that are really there to extract, to measure, to calculate, to manage, and to speciate, to make clear which species are there, including which species of humans, with the races of humans are there to be numbered. Suddenly, images that are murky, ambiguous, operate in a very strange way, not through efficacy. They don't become more and more precise way of attaining goals, but they open up this space that is not a democratic space. Nobody's voting for anything, but it's a space that is moved, where people are moved towards this new figure. And this is where we started thinking more carefully about being architects, and what does it mean to form such a space? What does it mean to form a space where you don't hold anything in common? You actually don't even share the data. You don't want to discuss. And we think this is a really interesting space, because it means to form a space where you have to build together what you want to discuss. There's no pre-stated ways of doing it. You can only do it. And what is interesting is that it has many resemblances to diplomacy. So there are ways in which we have histories of diplomatic encounters, that you have to go into a negotiation thinking that you will transform, and that you will transform yourself and the other, but you don't know whether your interlocutor is truthful or not. And you don't share the same notion of truth, of course. So sea level rise, so that we understand where we come to the sensible zone. So this is Venice. In blue in the front you see the sea. It's the lagoon, but it's the level of the sea. And this is taken in May 2020. The exhibition, of course, never happened as an exhibition full of people. We had to go online. It was a disaster. I'm skipping that. The water, if we are all good boys and girls, and we do manage to meet the Paris Agreement, actually the minimum aspect of the Paris Agreement of 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial will go up on that white line, which is LED light that marks the future. So if we are all good boys and girls, this is what we've committed in Paris, to have areas of around 1.5 billion people inhabiting them submerged. And we cheered in Paris because and we're still fighting for that goal. That line that in Venice was pulsating during the pandemic, at the height of the pandemic, it was the only thing happening in Venice, this pulsating light and the public program associated to sea level rise for the Venetians, bringing in discussion with them, trying to cope with acqua granda, the rising water, with the help of people from the Pacific, with the help of people from the Indian Ocean, try to cope with this idea that for the first time, energy transition not only is not possible to expand, but we have to withdraw. And we don't have intellectual capacity to withdraw. We don't know how to do it. We have never done it before. Humans have never had to step back. And this is really the difficult element. So what we are talking about is that if we are good boys and girls, next century, we don't know exactly when, the cryosphere will start melting at a much faster ratio and add to the major structure of sea level, which is the warming of the ocean. When you warm water, it expands, like in the kettle, it grows. In this century, in the 21st century, we've already seen an increase over any of the most radical predictions. We are thinking that a conservative forecast by the end of the century is 1.5 meters. In the coming century, it will be between 4.5 to 6 meters. And this is the blue area that you see here. This is in Argentina and Uruguay. It's areas that are going to be completely submerged. And when we saw that as architects, we looked quite in detail, and we were shocked because Shanghai is there. All the rapid urbanization of the last 30 years is there. All the internet, Silicon Valley, underwater. Now, first you go through trauma, and then you get angry, because it's stuff that architects did. And then you really have to swallow it and understand what are the forms, no longer of activism, of action, that we are going to take in order to survive in that scenario. And this is where the sensible zone idea comes in. The sensible zone is really where the water is, at the level of the sea. 200 meters down, as you said, you still have enough light to have photosynthesis. Actually, the majority of marine life is at between 0 and minus 100 meters. And all of that life, which is, I remind you, every second breath is produced by the photosynthesis, the oxygen is produced by the photosynthesis in the ocean, becomes the beginning of the trophic cascade for land. But it's also the area where we are. Urbanization, Shanghai, Silicon Valley, we've become a coastal species. We used to be more or less scattered around our Earth in temperate climates in a more or less equal way. Now we are amassing at 5 times more density than any other place on the coast. And this is the difficult thing, because that's where we have to withdraw from. And that's where we have all the hospitals, the network of supply. The majority of nuclear power plants are there, the structures of plantations are all there, and this is really the sensible zone. And this is where we start thinking that if there is a spatial dimension to the border technologies or remote sensing, is to become more sensitive to this part of the world that is the most sensitive part. So how do we become sensitive to other forms becoming sensitive? And this is really the question. How do we understand that we are not the only ones sensing? Technology is sensing us. It's quasi-conscient. Plants are sensing, fungi, bacteria, viruses, of course. We've seen them in the last 2 years, what they do. And it is also the place where we can start making sense of climate change. So it's not only the sensitive zone, it's the sensible zone, because we need to become sensible to it. And it's a space that requires a new imaginary, and we propose upstairs a very simple expansion to this project of the sensible zone by looking at what is the sensible zone in this part of the world? What is we call it the Baltic sensible zone. I mean, we're not on the coast here, but this is part of the sensible zone. Chernobyl is part of the sensible zone. And the point is that it's no longer just about reducing energy consumption. It's that we need to actually increase energy in order for the technosphere to start recycling. And the question, I think that you pointed out, is it a 500 years? Actually, it's a 4.5 billion year transformation. It's a geological transformation. And the border technologies, I don't know if it's working, that mark the Baltic are really peculiar. We all know that the Baltic is the second largest dead zone on the planet. The Baltic Sea is dead. There's too much anaerobic digestion of the biosphere that has been increasingly fed by the runoff of agriculture. All the fertilizers that come actually from fossil fuels, from petroleum, are running off into the Baltic Sea and transforming it into a gigantic space where there's so much food that all the algae, all the grassland are booming, and they are becoming so vast that there's no space for oxygen, and that has killed the Baltic Sea. And you see here a little example of the installation upstairs. All the multi-temporal analysis of extractive mines, and coal mines in particular, that are still the burden, not only of this country, but of the entire region. The underwater cables, I remember when you were calling me, where is the landmark? I never understood if you actually found it. And this is an image of the dead Baltic Sea. You might, from time to time, spot a little boat that flies through that. That is several dozens of kilometers wide image, and in the summer it's always murky, and what is it? It's nothing else than the result of the intensification of anthro-biogeochemical cycles. The material, energy, and information cycles that form the technosphere. And so the question is really how to move with images, because it's really art. It's culture, it's theater that moves people. It's not politics, it's art that moves people. How do we find that tipping point with images to achieve climate peace? Thank you. And of course, questions.
Anybody has any questions?
Thanks a lot for the brilliant talk. I have one question, because you mentioned the complications when it comes to gathering data, also access to data, open access data. I wondered, because I used to work also with open data on a project in oceanography, and there we realized that the currents of the sea were computed or are computed partially from data that is being retrieved from the vessels themselves with a data set that is called the automated identification system. And the interesting bit here was to kind of realize that those vessels are in a way the providers for the information, but at the same time they feed back into the system itself, of course, through carbon that is being offsetted into the atmosphere, etc. And also when you mentioned basically the Navy and US defense institutions basically being the major institutions that hold the data, or
not
some
only,
of them?
Not only US. Polish, Danish, Russian,
yeah.
Japanese, Indian.
Then again, thinking that these are like knowing that a lot of the military institutions or organizations again have like a huge impact on the feedback, the systems they are surveilling again. So I wonder, are we at the point where it doesn't really make sense to rely on data anymore? Because by kind of taking the data, we again change the system we are trying to observe. Or what kind of modes of kind of gathering information about the systems can we come up with? Is it more about maybe qualitative instead of quantitative data? Is there even a solution?
Yeah, I think that one can no longer go a priori and discuss what kind of information I need. And there are waves of knowing. The oceanic is multiple. It's always in the plural. And it includes those who want to fish. It's really difficult to grasp. For instance, the entire ethics of, say, climate activism is largely dominated by the idea that you should not eat meat. I think that is extremely detrimental. I think we should have a choice, and meat should be produced properly. So I think that the project is not indicating an idealized world where that we can achieve, but it's necessarily dirty, it's necessarily murky, it's compromised. It's I mentioned the warm war, and you indicated clearly. No, it's the military is the largest oil consumer in the world. No, I don't know how much oil has been and gas has been diverted to Ukraine since February. No, it's madness. But we never discuss it. Why don't we discuss it? I think we don't discuss it exactly because the imaginal technologies that are at play there, with data, with numbers, don't become images. They remain in the realm of management, of efficacy, of which in my understanding is nothing else than the logistical answer. So the difficult element that I'm indicating is that we are all implicated. We are, even our counter-systemic actions are still dominated by the same technologies. And the question is, how do we get as close as possible to them to have something happen? And I think that the question is really not to have, how to avoid being the same as logistical. You cannot fight a structure by simply replicating its own systems. And I have the impression that contemporary activism is doing nothing else than that. We do everything but open source, but it's still technology. We're just adding technology. We go renewable, but we just put more technology. The question is not that. The question is that the technosphere is not in our hands. The technosphere, which is a horrible word, by the way, because it has techno, which is not that really interesting music. It should be maybe another thing. And then it has this idea of completeness of sphere. It's a really bad word by Peter, but we should find a new word. This thing that interferes with Gaia, we are part of it. My cells are part of it. Now, every single one of us carries radionuclides, not only from Chernobyl, but from the nuclear tests in the Pacific. And those of you who think that I've been spared because you were born after the nuclear test ban, no, it has been passed to you by your mother. it's us. And it's so difficult to grasp. And the more we try to make intuitive, say, oppositions to it, the less we have the swerve, the less we have the capacity of moving, the more we become logistical. And it's really complicated because we are brought up, it's an entire civilization to fix, to have a place for everything and everything neatly in its place. And this is really the difficult part. And I was really admiring your presentation earlier because it was so close to saying that, look, you can't step out. You're always inside. So in terms of data, just to conclude the answer, I think that it's always interesting to remind ourselves that when President Obama made his first bid to become president, he was running on an idea of making Washington more accountable. You remember? He started the open data for government. It took 8 years. And in the meantime, someone who was 18 years old became 26 years old, and he finished his job of, and now you can go and check every single bill and understand where your pennies go, or cents, or how do you call it, nickels? It was not Obama who signed the bill. It was Trump. It took 2 terms to do that open data thing, and then it was Trump. Is it good or bad? I don't know. Certain aspects of government have nothing to do with who is governing. Governance has nothing to do with who is in power. It's a form of power that is multiple. It's technology. And it's really difficult to understand that. Open data, everything that activists stand for, was put in law by Donald Trump. So this is really the question of the border. Technology is a border, and it produces borders, it modifies borders, it shifts who can go in and out, but borders are always imaginal. They are ephemeral. Some people see them, other people can just go through.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Anybody else?
In your presentation, you kept making this distinction between action and activism, and I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about that and why activism is part of the problem. I think I understand where you're coming from, but I wanted to hear you say more.
You had that tiered notions of where to act. I think that this is something that I learned from our friends at Greenpeace. There's a sort of tiredness around the idea of a deficit form of activism, a deficit that you need to fill. If only you would feel what I feel about the dolphins, you would change your life. If only you would know what I know about the forest in Bialystok, you would change your mind. If only you would see what I see. It's always a deficit gap. I think that has done fantastic work. It has established a larger understanding of human rights, of rights of nature, but it has also consolidated international humanitarian law. And I'm a little bit coming from a different side to that. I think that what is happening today is that the state has opened up. And from above, through international humanitarian law, the international, and from beneath, the corporations have now assumed different forms of violence. So in my mind, activism today is action in close proximity to those structures that are warping the state, that are making it undecipherable, that we don't see, we don't understand. So we need to somehow be as close as possible to the structures that generate form in order to modify them. And I have the impression that the larger forms of activism that we are discussing usually are still of the deficit side. And I saw that, I understood that you were going in a similar direction, if I'm in different languages, but...
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.